The First English Civil War started in 1642. By the end of the year neither side had succeeded in gaining an advantage. Although the king's advance on London was the closest Royalist forces came to threatening the city. Campaign of 1642. When the king raised his standard at Nottingham on the 22nd of August 1642, war was already in progress on a small scale in many districts, each side endeavouring to secure, or to deny to the enemy, fortified country houses, territory, and above all arms and money. Peace negotiations went on in the midst of these minor events, until there came from the Parliament an ultimatum, so aggressive as to fix the warlike purpose of the still vacillating court at Nottingham, and in the country at large, to convert many thousands of waverers to active royalism. Ere long, Charles, who hitherto had fewer than 1,500 men, was at the head of an army which, though very deficient in arms and equipment, was not greatly inferior in numbers or enthusiasm to that of Parliament. The latter was organized during July, August, and September about London, and moved from there to Northampton under the command of Lord Essex. At this moment, the military situation was as follows. The Marquess of Hertford in South Wales, Hopton in Cornwall, and the young Earl of Derby in Lancashire, and small parties in almost every county of the West and the Midlands, were in arms for the king. North of the Tees, Newcastle, a great territorial magnate, was raising troops and supplies for the king, while Queen Henrietta Maria was busy in Holland, arranging for the importation of war material and money. In Yorkshire, opinion was divided, the royal cause being strongest in York and the North Riding, that of the parliamentary party. In the clothing towns of the West Riding, the important seaport of Hull had a royalist civilian population, but Sir John Hotham, the military governor, and the garrison supported Parliament. During the summer Charles had tried to seize ammunition stored in the city but had been forcefully rebuffed. The Yorkshire gentry made an attempt to neutralize the county, but a local struggle soon began, and Newcastle thereupon prepared to invade Yorkshire, the whole of the south and east, as well as parts of the Midlands and the west, and the important towns of Bristol and Gloucester were on the side of the Parliament. A small royalist force was compelled to evacuate Oxford on the 10th of September. On the 13th of September, the main campaign opened. The king, in order to find recruits amongst his sympathizers and arms in the armories of the Derbyshire and Staffordshire trained bands, and also to be in touch with his disciplined regiments in Ireland by way of Chester, moved westward to Shrewsbury. Essex followed suit by marching his army from Northampton to Worcester. Near here, a sharp cavalry engagement, Poeg Bridge, took place on the 23rd of September between the advanced cavalry of Essex's army and a force under Prince Rupert, which was engaged in protecting the retirement of the Oxford detachment. The result of the fight was the immediate overthrow of the parliamentary cavalry, and this gave the royalist troopers a confidence in themselves and in the brilliant leader, which was not shaken until they met Oliver Cromwell's Ironsides. Rupert soon withdrew to Shrewsbury, where he found many royalist officers eager to attack Essex's new position at Worcester. But the road to London now lay open and it was decided to take it. The intention was not to avoid a battle, for the royalist generals wanted to fight Essex before he grew too strong, and the temper of both sides made it impossible to postpone the decision. In the Earl of Clarendon's words, it was considered more counsellable to march towards London, it being morally sure that Essex would put himself in the way. Accordingly, the army left Shrewsbury on the 12th of October, gaining 2 days' start on the enemy, and moved southeast via Bridge North, Birmingham, and Kenilworth. This had the desired effect. Parliament, alarmed for its own safety, sent repeated orders to Essex to find the king and bring him to battle. Alarm gave place to determination when it was discovered that Charles was enlisting papists and seeking foreign aid. The militia of the home counties was called out. A second army under Warwick was formed round the nucleus of the London-trained bands, and Essex, straining every nerve to regain touch with the enemy, reached Kyneton, where he was only 7 miles from the king's headquarters at Edgecote, on the 22nd of October. Battle of Edge Hill. Rupert promptly reported the enemy's presence, and his confidence dominated the irresolution of the king, and the caution of the Earl of Lindsey, the nominal commander-in-chief. Both sides had marched, widely dispersed in order to live, and the rapidity with which, having the clearer purpose, the Royalists drew together, helped considerably to neutralize Essex's superior numbers. During the morning of the 23rd of October 1642, the Royalists formed in battle order on the brow of Edge Hill, facing towards Kyneton. Essex, experienced soldier as he was, had distrusted his own raw army too much to force a decision earlier in the month. When the king was weak, he now found Charles in a strong position with an equal force to his own 14,000, and some of his regiments were still some miles distant. But he advanced beyond Kyneton, and the enemy promptly left the strong position and came down to the foot of the hill. Situated as they were, they had either to fight wherever they could induce the enemy to engage, or to starve in the midst of hostile garrisons. Rupert was on the right of the king's army with the greater part of the horse, Lord Lindsay and Sir Jacob Astley in the centre with the foot, while Henry Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, with a smaller body of cavalry, was on the left. In rear of the centre were the king and a small reserve. Essex's order was similar. Rupert charged as soon as his wing was deployed, and before the infantry of either side were ready, taking ground to his right front and then wheeling inwards at full speed, he instantly rode down the parliamentary horse opposed to him. Some infantry regiments of Essex's left centre shared the same fate as the cavalry. On the other wing, Forth and Wilmot likewise swept away all that they could see of the enemy's cavalry. The undisciplined Royalists of both wings pursued the fugitives in wild disorder up to Kyneton, where they were severely handled by John Hampton's infantry brigade. Rupert brought back only a few rallied squadrons to the battlefield, and in the meantime affairs that had gone badly for the king. The right and centre of the parliamentary foot advanced with great resolution, being at least as ardent as, and much better armed than Lindsay's men. They engaged the latter fiercely and slowly gained ground. Only the best regiments on either side, however, maintained their order, and the decision of the infantry battle was achieved mainly by a few parliamentary squadrons. One regiment of Essex's right wing had been the target of Wilmot's charge. The other two had been at the moment invisible, and every Royalist troop on the ground, including the King's Guards, joined in the mad ride to Kyneton. This regiment, Essex's Life Guard, and some troops that had rallied from the effect of Rupert's charge were the only cavalry still present. They now joined with decisive effect in the attack on the left of the Royal Infantry. The king's line was steadily rolled up from left to right. The parliamentary troopers captured his guns, and regiment after regiment broke up. Charles himself stood calmly in the thick of the fight, but he had not the skill to direct it. The royal standard was taken and retaken. Sir Edmund Verney, the standard-bearer, was killed, as was Lindsay in a separate melee. By the time that Rupert returned, both sides were incapable of further effort and disillusioned as to the prospect of ending the war at a blow. So far from settling the issue, the Battle of Edge Hill was to be the first of a series of pitched battles. On the 24th of October, Essex retired, leaving Charles to claim victory and to reap its results. Banbury and Oxford were reoccupied by the Royalists, and by the 28th of October, Charles was marching down the Thames Valley on London. Negotiations were reopened, and a peace party rapidly formed itself in London and Westminster. Yet field fortifications sprang up around London, and when Rupert stormed Brentford and sacked it on the 12th of November, the trained bands moved out at once and took up a position at Turnham Green, barring the King's advance. Hampden, with something of the fire and energy of his cousin, Cromwell, urged Essex to turn both flanks of the Royal Army via Acton and Kingston. Experienced professional soldiers, however, urged him not to trust the London men to hold the ground, while the rest manoeuvred. Hampden's advice was undoubtedly premature. A Sedan or Worcester was not within the power of the parliamentarians of 1642. In Napoleon's words, one only maneuvers around a fixed point, and the city levies at the time were certainly not, vis-a-vis Rupert's cavalry, a fixed point. As a matter of fact, after a slight cannonade at the Battle of Turnham Green on the 13th of November, Essex's 2-to-1 numerical superiority of itself compelled the king to retire to Reading. Turnham Green has justly been called the Valmy of the English Civil War, for like the Battle of Valmy it was a victory without having to come to battle, and the tide of invasion having reached this far ebbed and never returned. The winter of 1642–43. In the winter, while Essex's army lay inactive at Windsor, Charles by degrees consolidated his position in the region of Oxford. The city was fortified as a redoubt for the whole area, and Reading, Wallingford, Abingdon, Brill, Banbury and Marlborough constituted a complete defensive ring which was developed by the creation of smaller posts from time to time. In the north and west, winter campaigns were actively carried on. "It is summer in Yorkshire, summer in Devon, and cold winter at Windsor," said one of Essex's critics. At the beginning of December 1642, Newcastle crossed the River Tees, defeated Sir John Hutham, the parliamentary commander in the North Riding. He then joined hands with the hard-pressed Royalists at York, establishing himself between that city and Pontefract. Lord Fairfax of Cameron and his son Sir Thomas Fairfax, who commanded for the Parliament in Yorkshire, had to retire to the district between Hull and Selby, and Newcastle was now free to turn his attention to the Puritan clothing towns of the West Riding, Leeds, Halifax and Bradford. The townsmen, however, showed a determined front. Sir Thomas Fairfax with a picked body of cavalry rode through Newcastle's lines into the West Riding to help them, and about the end of January 1643, Newcastle gave up the attempt to reduce the towns. Newcastle continued his march southward, however, and gained ground for the king as far as Newark-on-Trent, so as to be in touch with the Royalists of Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Leicestershire, and to prepare the way for the further advance of the Army of the North when the Queen's convoy should arrive from overseas. In the West, Hopton and his friends, having obtained a true bill from the Grand Jury against the parliamentary disturbers of the peace, placed themselves at the head of the county militia. They drove the rebels from Cornwall, after which they raised a small force for general service and invaded Devonshire in November 1642. Subsequently, a parliamentary army under the Earl of Stamford was withdrawn from South Wales to engage Hopton, who had to retire into Cornwall. There, however, the Royalist general was free to employ the militia again, and thus reinforce. He won a victory over a part of Stamford's forces at the Battle of Braddock Down near Liskeard on the 19th of January 1643 and resumed the offensive. About the same time, Hertford, no longer opposed by Stamford, brought over the South Wales Royalists to Oxford. The fortified area around that place was widened by the capture of Cirencester on the 2nd of February. Gloucester and Bristol were now the only important garrisons of the Roundheads in the west. In the Midlands, in spite of a parliamentary victory won by Sir William Brereton at the Battle of Nantwich on the 28th of January, the Royalists of Shropshire, Staffordshire, and Leicestershire soon extended their influence through Ashby-de-la-Zouch into Nottinghamshire and joined hands with the Friends at Newark. Around Chester, a new Royalist army was being formed under the Lord Byron, and all the efforts of Sir John Brereton and of Sir John Gell, 1st Baronet, the leading supporter of Parliament in Derbyshire, were required to hold their own, even before Newcastle's army was added to the list of their enemies. The Lord Brooke, who commanded for Parliament in Warwickshire and Staffordshire and was looked on by many as Essex's eventual successor, was killed in besieging Lichfield Cathedral on the 2nd of March, and, though the cathedral soon capitulated, Gell and Brereton were severely handled in the indecisive Battle of Hopton Heath near Stafford on the 19th of March, and Prince Rupert, after an abortive raid on Bristol, marched rapidly northward, storming Birmingham en route, and recaptured Lichfield Cathedral. He was, however, soon recalled to Oxford to take part in the main campaign. The position of affairs for Parliament was perhaps at its worst in January. The Royalist successes of November and December, the ever-present dread of foreign intervention, and a burden of new taxation which Parliament now found itself compelled to impose, disheartened its supporters. Disorders broke out in London, and, while the more determined of the rebels began thus early to think of calling in the military assistance of the Scots, the majority were for peace on any conditions. But soon the position improved somewhat. The Earl of Stamford in the west and Brereton and Gell in the Midlands, though hard-pressed, were at any rate in arms, and undefeated Newcastle had failed to conquer West Riding, and Sir William Waller, who had cleared Hampshire and Wiltshire of malignants, entered Gloucestershire early in March, destroyed a small Royalist force at Hineham on the 24th of March, and secured Bristol and Gloucester for Parliament. Finally, some of Charles's own intrigues opportunely came to light. The Waverers, seeing the impossibility of plain dealing with the court, rallied again to the party of resistance. The series of negotiations called by the name of the Treaty of Oxford closed in April, with no more result than those which had preceded Edge Hill and Turnham Green. About this time too, following and improving upon the example of Newcastle in the north, Parliament ordered the formation of the celebrated associations, or groups of counties banded together by mutual consent for defence. The most powerful and best organised of these was that of the eastern counties, where the danger of attack from the north was near enough to induce great energy in the preparations for meeting it, and at the same time, too distant effectively to interfere with these preparations. Above all, the Eastern Association was from the first guided and inspired by Colonel Cromwell. The field fortifications that were hastily thrown up during the summer of 1642 to defend London were supplemented with the lines of communication that were commissioned by Parliament in 1642 and completed in 1643.